Greetings and welcome back to Room 303. We turn now in our Harvard Classics lecture, volume number 4, to lecture 19 and Paradise Lost book number 5. Now, before we get into this conversation, as we've done in all of our earlier lectures as well, let's make sure that we remind you that it makes sense that if you're just meeting these lectures for the very first time, that you want to go back. Go to learnstrong.net, find that link down the left-hand side that says something about Harvard Classics, and then maybe watch some of the previous lectures. For sure, watch the intro lecture, and I would say for sure watch the lectures on Milton that we've already presented. Let's just quickly now give a quick review of where we've been. Paradise Lost, Book 1. We start with the invocation. We're going to be told this is going to be the story of the Garden of Eden account of Genesis 3. We are introduced to Satan, and at the end of Book 1, the creation of Pandemonium. Book 2, we learn about the plan that Satan has to get vengeance on God for throwing him out of heaven. And the way this is going to happen, of course, is going to require that Satan take this journey or this odyssey, leave hell, ultimately find his way to paradise, to Eden, and then from there on we go. Book 3, meet God in the Son for the first time in heaven. We're introduced to this question of theodicy. How is it explainable that a all-powerful, all-loving deity is able to create a world where there is evil, pain, sin, suffering? And the answer, of course, provided is free will. Adam and Eve are given the opportunity to choose whether to follow God or not by virtue of eating of this forbidden fruit. We'll get into more of that here in Book 5 in a bit. And of course, by the end of it, we also see Satan. He has arrived at Eden, sitting there at the top of the top of Nephates, this mountain, ready to start to do nasties. Book 4, we just finished a few seconds ago. In Book 4, we meet Adam and we meet Eve. Of course, we had our conversation about the patriarchy and the role of the patriarchy and understanding how to read Book 4. And as well, we are going to see Satan at the end as a toad. And of course, there's going to be that confrontation between Satan and Gabriel. And there's some debate as to why it is the case that in Milton's poem, Gabriel allows Satan to leave. Again, there seems to be this notion that God really wants to give Adam and Eve the opportunity to prove their fidelity, and that's going to be an important part of the theodictic argument that Milton will make. Now, let's just point out that books 1 through 4 is often considered part 1 of Paradise Lost. You've made it through the first 4 books. Congrats. This is the toughest part of the reading, actually, of Paradise Lost. Once you've gotten to Book 5, you should begin to kind of have a sense of how to read this stuff so that it makes sense to you. I certainly hope so. We now turn to part 2. Let's put it in our notes. Paradise Lost, Book 5 and Book 6 should be read as kind of a unit. And the reason is because we're going to have the angel Raphael who will be presenting information as a messenger, a divine messenger. And that will be significant because he's going to tell the story of actually the fall of Satan. It's been referred to in the first 4 books, but we don't actually know the full story in the same way that Adam himself doesn't know the full story. Let's point out for your notes that when we study the epic form, often it will begin in medias res, that is to say, in the middle of the action, a Latin term. And we will begin with Paradise Lost in the middle of the action, with Satan having fallen and down onto the fire lake in hell. But now we're going to hear some of the backstory. Maybe that's a way to say it. We're going to hear about Satan's fall. Of course, let's point out there are a lot of falls in Paradise Lost, as we have said. Now, just to remind, our 3 levels of reading. We're studying Paradise Lost, of course, with those 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Level 2A, themes, messages. 2B, the rhetoric or the rhetorical techniques. Not what Milton says, but how Milton says it. And then level 3, how do we relate to the text? Relate to other texts, relate to the world, and of course also at 3B, relate to ourselves personally. We're also studying Paradise Lost in 3 ways. 1, as an epic. We've already mentioned in medias res and other ways that this is an epic poem. We study it as a work of philosophy and theology. Our comments about theodicy come to mind. We're also going to ask, though, about philosophic understandings of epistemology, what we know, ontology, the study of who we are. We'll get to that one in a moment. Also, we study Paradise Lost as a political text. In other words, what is the psychological understandings or sociological understandings that are going on? And here, and we've made comments already, we'll continue to do so. Now, let's turn to level 1 of Book 5. Let Milton tell his story of the fall of Satan and how significant that is in Satan's theodicy. Our goal, again, just to remind, is to be both entertained as well as challenged. Challenged is important for us, isn't it? For example, how about this one? Is it true? We're going to come back to this question. I'm just setting you up because in Book 5 this question becomes really kind of central. Is it true that what you know, epistemology, has some important role to play in how you think of who you are, ontology? For example, think about the tension that we saw already when we studied Hamlet. Remember, those soliloquies are so important, but remember that Act 4 soliloquy where Hamlet is watching all those soldiers who are about to march off to go to war, and he begins to ask about what's the difference between a human and an animal. And he says the thing that's different is that humans have this thing called reason, the capacity to think. And Hamlet actually says it. Surely God, the deity, did not give humans reason to fuss, waste in us unused. In other words, Hamlet says, surely the thing that's important about being human is our capacity to think and therefore to know. Well, the obvious question is this one. Is the quest of and for knowledge good or bad, useful or dangerous? Is the quest for knowledge of God, or is it rather satanic? Let's pay attention, for example, to just the way the word knowledge gets used in Book 5 as we begin our work here together. Now, as we've done in the past, we'll do again. Let's take a look, first of all, at the argument. We'll summarize the primary plot developments, and then we'll get into the actual language itself. And as I've said in earlier lectures, I would love to be able to just, read all of this with you, but obviously I can't, right? And so let's go ahead and just take a look now. Here's the argument for the 5th book. Morning approached. Eve relates to Adam her troublesome dream. He likes it not. Yet it comforts her. They come forth to their day labors, their morning hymns at the door of their bower. God, to render man inexcusable, sends Raphael to admonish him of his obedience, of his free estate, of his enemy near at hand, who he is, why his enemy, and whatever else may avail Adam to know. Raphael comes down to paradise, his appearance described, his coming discerned by Adam afar off, sitting at the door of his bower. He goes out to meet him, brings him to his lodge, entertains him with the choicest fruits of paradise, got together by Eve. Their discourse at table. Raphael performs his message, minds Adam of his state and of his enemy, relates to Adam's request, who that enemy is, and how he came to be so. Beginning from his first revolt in heaven, and the occasion thereof, how he drew his legions after him to the parts of the north, and there incited them to rebel with him, persuading all but only Abdiel, Seraph, who in argument dissuades and opposes him, then forsakes him. And we will finish, of course, with Abdiel's great stand-up to Satan. Now let's summarize quickly Book 5, as we just read it. Eve, of course, had Satan as a toad in her ear the night before while she slept. That was Book 4. She wakes and says, I had a bad dream. Adam will say, just a dream, not to worry. God, watching this, will say to Raphael, the messenger angel, you better get out there and you better explain to these guys what danger is coming. And of course, Raphael is sent. Raphael is met by Adam and Eve. He will begin a story that he will finish in Book 6. You want to write that down. In other words, the story is not going to finish with just Book 5. It's going to be Book 6, which is why Book 5 and Book 6 are often seen as kind of companion texts, okay? At the end of the story, in the part of Book 5, when Satan is about to revolt, there will be an angel who is called to Satan's troops who will stand up against Satan. His name is Abdiel. And of course, we'll be talking at the end of this lecture about nonconformity and the power of nonconformity and the independent mind and all of that. All right? And then, of course, in Book 6, we'll continue with the end of Raphael's story, the fight in heaven, and ultimately the ways in which Satan is thrown out of heaven because he loses. Lines 1 through 25. Let's just enjoy the language for a few moments. Now, morn her rosy steps in the eastern clime, advancing so the earth with orient peril. When Adam waked, so customed, for his sleep was airy light, from pure digested bread, and temperate vapors bland, which the only sound of leaves and fuming rills, Aurora's fan, lightly dispersed, and the shrill matin song of birds on every bough. So again, we're back to Eden, and it's beautiful, and in the morning when you wake up, it's like waking up in a Disney movie, right? Okay, everything's great. So much the more, his wonder was to find unawakened Eve with tresses discomposed. Again, we're back to Eve and her hair. Always when Milton talks about Eve and her hair, it's almost always going to be like this. It's all over the place. It's long, it's all over the place, it's discomposed. And glowing cheek, as through unquiet rest. In other words, he can tell that Eve hasn't been sleeping well. He on his side, leaning half raised, with looks of cordial love, hung over her enamored, and beheld beauty which, whether waking or asleep, shot forth peculiar graces. In other words, he looks at Eve and thinks, amazing, totally stunning and amazing. Put it in your notes. Foreshadowing will begin already. The infatuation that Adam has for Eve is ultimately going to lead to Adam believing that he has to eat of the forbidden fruit and participate in Eve's fall, simply because he is so enamored of her beauty. Of course, there is an underlying message here by Milton. Guys, be aware of drop-dead gorgeous girls, right? Then, with voice mild as when Zephyrus on Flora breathes, her hand soft touching, whispered thus. Adam will whisper to Eve, awake, my fairest, my espoused, my latest found heaven's last best gift, my ever new delight. Awake! The morning shines and the fresh field calls us. We lose the prime to mark how spring our tended plants, how blows the Crichton grove, how nature paints her colors, how the bee sits on the bloom, extracting liquid sweet. In other words, he whispers to her twice, wake up. Let's go ahead and just point out that many readers of this poem recognize that Milton likes to begin with themes early in each of these books. And the theme that he begins with in this book is wake up, awake, awake, let's go, let's go, let's go. Of course, there will be this question about in what ways is knowledge a waking up, right? Well, we're told that it works. She wakes up and she immediately begins to tell about the dream that she had. Now, this is an interesting dream, and we'll jump down to line 38 or so. In the dream, she has a voice that speaks to her. Now, of course, Eve has heard other voices, like you're not supposed to look at yourself in your lake reflection, but rather go back to the man who will be your man. Here, she says that she heard a voice. Because it was an irksome night, line 35 or so. It was an irksome night. She had bad dreams. The voice says, why sleepest thou, Eve? Now is the pleasant time, the cool, the silent, save where silence yields to the night warbling bird that now awake tunes sweetest his love-laboring song. Now reigns full-orbed the moon. So, in other words, it's time to wake up. This is what the voice says. Heaven wakes with all his eyes, whom to behold but thee? Nature's desire, in whose sight all things joy, with ravishment attracted by thy beauty still to gaze. In other words, everyone in heaven wants to see how beautiful you are. Get up. I rose, she says, in her dream, as at thy call, but found thee not. In other words, she thinks it was Adam who called her, but it wasn't. To find thee I directed then my walk, and on me thought, alone, we know that that's an important word in Paradise Lost, I passed through ways that brought me on a sudden to the tree of interdicted knowledge. In other words, she says, in my dream, I was told first, get up, and then I followed the voice, and it led me to the tree that is the forbidden tree of knowledge. Fair, it seemed, much fairer to my fancy than by day. In other words, it looked beautiful. And as I wondering looked, beside it stood one shaped and winged, like one of those from heaven by us oft seen. In other words, an angel. His dewy locks distilled ambrosia. On that tree, back to more hair by the way with locks, on that tree he also gazed. And, O fair plant, said he, with fruit surcharged, deigns not to ease thy load, and taste thy sweet, nor God, nor man. And then the voice asks, is knowledge so despised? Notice these rhetorical questions that are obviously, this is the major setup, isn't it? We know that this is the setup for what later will happen, of course, in Book 9, when Eve finally will eat from the forbidden fruit. Is knowledge so despised? Or envy? Or what reserve forbids to taste? Forbid who will? None shall from me withhold longer thy offered good, Why else set here? In other words, if the tree is here at all, it's here to have the fruit eaten. Why wouldn't you want to eat the fruit? It doesn't make any sense. Rational argument? Irrational argument? This said, she says, he paused not, but with venturous arm he plucked and tasted. So in other words, of course, this is the satanic force in her dream, right? He grabs the fruit, he eats it. Me, damp, horror chilled at such bold words vouchsafed with a deed so bold. But he thus, overjoyed, of course, the act of temptation now. "O fruit divine," he says about the fruit, "sweet of thyself, but much more sweet thus cropped, forbidden here." In other words, forbidden waters are sweet, the book of Proverbs says in the Bible, and here he's saying this. This is even better tasting because you're told not to eat it, and now you get to eat it. Forbidden here it seems is only fit for gods, yet able to make gods of men. You'll remember in the Genesis 3 account, this is the promise, that if you eat, you will become like gods, knowing good and evil. And why not gods of men, since good the more communicated, more abundant grows, the author not impaired, but honored more. Here, happy creature, fair angelic Eve, partake thou also. So he hands the fruit to her. Happy though thou art, happier thou mayest be, worthier canst not be. Taste this, and be henceforth among the gods, thyself a goddess. Well, let's pause for a moment and just point out what the promise here is. Eat from the forbidden fruit, and you will become like a god. Why not? The fruit is here, you might as well. The art of temptation, as Milton will describe it. Well, of course, Eve will finish by saying this was bad news. Adam will say at line 95, it was just a dream. He says, best image of myself at line 95, and dearer half, the trouble of thy thoughts this night in sleep affects me equally. Nor can I like this uncouth dream of evil sprung, I fear. Yet evil whence? He says, in thee can harbor none created pure. In other words, there is no evil in us. We're not capable of it. But know that in the soul are many lesser faculties that serve reason as chief. He says, it's possible that maybe this is a bad omen. Yet, he says at line 116, be not sad. Evil into the mind of God or man may come and go, so unapproved, and leave no spot or blame behind, which gives me hope that what in sleep thou didst abhor to dream, waking thou never wilt consent to do. In other words, dreaming about doing something bad is one thing, actually doing it is entirely another. Don't worry about it, we're going to be fine. It seems that everything is fine here. Adam has comforted Eve. However, we're told at line 129, so cheered he his fair spouse. And she was cheered, but silently. A gentle tear let fall from either eye and wiped them with her hair. 2 other precious drops that ready stood, each in their crystal sluice. He, ere they fell, kissed as the gracious signs of sweet remorse and pious awe. In other words, we're told she cries tears, a couple of them. This, of course, all foreshadowing. It's almost as if Eve is encoded to know that she is going to be the one that will partake of the forbidden fruit. At line 153, we then begin with the famous morning song. Now, I wish that I had time to read this because it's amazing stuff from Milton's poetry, but he will then describe the song that is sung as they go off to sing, to work. They sing this amazing song of prayer about how amazing the world is. Line 205 to finish it. Hail, universal Lord, be bounteous still to give us only good. And if the night have gathered aught of evil or concealed, disperse it as now light dispels the dark. And then at the very end of it, as they go out to work at line 216, we're told they led the vine to wed her elm. In other words, in this situation, we have again the word picture of the patriarchy. Eve is the vine, Adam is the tree or the elm, and she will curl around him, the need, in other words, to have Adam always there. This notion of Adam being the protector of Eve is going to become important, so go ahead and write that down. We're going to see that one coming back. At line 224, we then will be introduced to God, who is watching this with his angel Raphael at line 224. And he says, Thou hearest what stir on earth Satan from hell scaped through the darksome gulf hath raised in and paradise, and now disturb this night the human pair. Now he designs in them at once to ruin all mankind. In other words, let's just put in our notes, God says now to Raphael, I know exactly what's about to happen. Satan's trying to ruin the creation. Go, he says, therefore, half this day as friend with friend, converse with Adam, and what bower or shade thou findest him, from the heat of noon retire to respite, his day labor with repast, or with repose. In other words, he says, go talk to Adam. And such discourse bring on as may advise him of his happy state, happiness in his power, left free to will. Left to his own free will, his will through, though free, yet mutable. Notice the word free and the word will here several times used. He swerved not to secure. Tell him withal his danger and from whom. What enemy, late fallen himself from heaven, is plotting now the fall of others from like state of bliss. By violence? No, for that shall be withstood, but by deceit and lies. This let him know. In other words, note the irony. Adam is told and Eve is told, you cannot eat from the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And yet notice, God will send Raphael for knowledge's sake. Let him know, lest, willfully transgressing, he pretend surprisal, unadmonished, unforewarned. In other words, he says, I am not going to be held responsible, God says. If Adam and Eve fall to temptation by Satan, they must be warned. Get out there and tell them. And then at line 246, so spake the eternal Father, and fulfilled all justice. It's an important line because, of course, it resonates with those opening lines of the invocation to justify the ways of God to man. This whole notion of just and justice. And of course, yes, you're right, at 3a,